is so wonderful to see all of you here tonight. And to echo what Elaine said, it is so special to be here at the Book Passage. This is a cornerstone in our community here and a very special place, and we're honored to be here with them tonight. And for all the Warriors fans, we do treasure that you are here with us. And thankfully now to modern technology, you can record the game and check out the results later. So my name is Bridget Lackey, and I do look after global sales for Geographic Expeditions. For those of you who may not know who we are, we've been around since 1982 and are proud of what we represent here in the Bay Area and around the world. We are able to go to places most people dream of, and we're able to make your dreams come true, whatever those may be. We do things from small group trips of 12 people or less, or we can customize and personalize whatever you and your friends and family may choose to do. We are very proud of the private journeys where we have personalized different experiences, where some of our guests are in the audience tonight. So we really do hope that you'll join us after the session this evening so we can have some more interesting discussions with you all. We are really honored to be here tonight, as Elaine mentioned, with Don George and Pico Iyer. They have been friends of ours for years, and we're treasured to be able to be here with them this evening. Both are celebrated travel writers. Don has been a travel writer and editor with the San Francisco Chronicle, Salon.com, Lonely Planet, and editor-at-large of National Geographic Expeditions. Also, he's the editor of GeoX and our Wanderlust blog, which I hope some of you do receive, and he's one of our top guides that works with us at Geographic Expeditions. And Pico, who also doesn't need much of an introduction, is a well-renowned author of 10 works of nonfiction and 2 novels, and recently he gave 3 TED Talks, which received over 8 million views. Pretty incredible to have both of them here with us tonight, and we're honored that you're here to celebrate that with us. So you'll see a newsletter from GeoX called Ultimate Too Late. Some of them might have been on your chair, you might have picked one when you came in. We also have some catalogs for you here this evening. That's just to give you a little bit of a taste of who we are and what we represent. But Don and Pico are going to do that very well themselves, so you really will understand what we stand by with our brand. And speaking of a little bit of taste, hopefully you'll get a chance to hang around after the great discussion and conversation. Join us in the back for some more nibbles and some wine, so we can answer any questions you have, and also you can spend some more time with Don and Pico. So thank you again for your time this evening. I hope you have a wonderful time. Enjoy the fabulous discussion between these 2 renowned gentlemen. And without further ado, I would love to welcome to the stage Mr. Don George and Pico Iyer.
I can't believe so many people are here. You must be here for Jeff Dyer, in which case you're in for a big disappointment. I am not Dyer, sorry. Watch the Warriors game just then. Thank you, Bridget. Actually, before we even begin, I wanted to say how really thrilled I am to be here. In the days when book tours were quite a thing, I would come here every year, sometimes more than once in a year. And every time I came, all America was saying, books are an endangered species, writers are a thing of the past. Each time I would come, Book Passage was larger and larger and larger. And over the years, Book Passage is the only bookstore in the world that has induced me to come and actually teach a course, more than once. It's the only bookstore in the world that actually got me to come to a writers' conference here in August, more than once. I met Jan Morris, the greatest traveler of our times here. I met Jason Rezaian, who's become one of the most prominent people in our news, right in this bookstore. And I think Bill and Elaine have been such friends to me for more than a quarter century, but I think friends to everybody who loves books. And I was just thinking, I mean, you all know how bookshops like this are the livelihood of ne'er-do-wells such as me. But I think they're the lifeblood of all of us. And just literally this day last week, I was visiting my mother in Santa Barbara, and I spent the whole day going from the drugstore to the lawyer's office, to the doctor's office, to the tax consultant. And I literally didn't have a chance to read the whole day. And I could feel myself getting thinner and shorter. I'm short enough already, but getting shorter and shorter. And it was almost as if I was losing a whole dimension of myself and turning from a three-dimensional person into just a two-dimensional icon on a screen. And it just reminded me who we would be if reading wasn't in our lives. And of course, you can get books on Amazon, you can read them on Kindle, all of which is great. But I think neither of those huge institutions hand sells books with the humanity of a shop like this, or rescues books that would otherwise be lost to us, or most of all, stitches us together in a community like this and brings us together for conversation so we can talk back to books and find kindred spirits yet. So it's a long-winded way of saying thank you, Elaine, for one of the great moments.
Thank you. And hurry back.
I was just enwrapped in your eloquence as always.
You know, I have to interrupt because Jason Rosayan, who came here as a student, and he remembers Pico encouraging him. And this year he is on the faculty of our Travel Writers Conference. So he says that it was the encouragement he got from both of you that made him decide to be a writer. So thank you.
Quite wonderful. It's great. I remember being at that breakfast with you and Jan Morris where you met her for the first time. And I felt like the proverbial person at the ping pong match or the tennis match. As you discussed books, I was just like, boom, boom, Jan, Pico, Jan, Pico, Jan, Pico, Jan, Pico. I was like, well, I read, oh no, Jan, Pico, Jan, Pico. I did not have a chance in that conversation. That was really delightful, I remember.
The first time I met Jan was in the hotel just down here. She was in her 70s, and she's famous as one of the most ebullient, open-hearted, generous writers in the world. And I'd just been introduced to her, and I said, how are you feeling? She said, rather miserable. And that's not a Jan Morris answer. So I said, how come? And she said, well, I just flew over from Wales, I'm 9 hours out of sync, and really, really jet lagged. And I said rather facetiously, well, I've always heard that the best cure for jet lag is to walk barefoot through the grass. Before I'd almost finished the sentence, Jan Morris, age 78, was walking through the lobby with her feet off, or with her shoes off, striding, maybe with her feet off too, striding across the lawn of the motel. I thought, this is what makes Jan Morris the gold standard for us all. She'll try anything.
She will try anything, right? Indeed. Yeah. So, Pico, of course, it's wonderful, wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence tonight. Thank you for gracing us with this wonderful book, which I hope you'll all buy and read. It's a beautiful, beautiful, poignant, moving, revelatory book. What I thought I'd try to do tonight is kind of bridge two themes, one being travel and one being your new book. And it strikes me that this book is clearly a bookend to The Lady and the Monk in a lot of ways. The Lady and the Monk, of course. How many people have read The Lady and the Monk, just out of curiosity? So you know it's an amazing, wonderful account of Pico's going to Japan to live and be a monk and deciding that wasn't quite exactly what he wanted to do, but falling in love with Japan and with Hiroko-san. And so there's that, and this is kind of the bookend of that at the other end of life, or near the part of the other end of life. And looking back at maybe the person who was there so many years ago, 30 years ago, and falling in love. But it also seemed to me that this is a really interesting bookend to your first book, Video Night in Kathmandu, and which is all about a young, impressionistic, easily impressionable young man wandering around the world having adventures. And that made me think about travel and what travel has been to you in your life. Beginning with Video Night, of course, travel's been a part of your life forever. So I wanted to ask you what travel represented for you back then, so let's say when you wrote Video Night, and how it's kind of evolved for you through the years, what travel means for you now.
Oh, what a thoughtful question. Travel in 1985 for me was just a way to escape the office. I was working for Time magazine, 25th floor office in Midtown Manhattan, having a wonderful time but knowing that I wanted to be loose in the world. And every week I would rewrite articles sent in by correspondents at the field. So a bomb would go off in Beirut, and my colleagues in Jerusalem, Beirut, Washington, London would send in reports, and I would write a vivid eyewitness account of a place I'd never seen. And Time magazine had one terrible problem as far as they were concerned in those days. They were extremely prosperous and generous to a fault. So as soon as I arrived in my mid-20s, I asked if I could take a 3-week vacation. They asked if I would make it 4, gentle hint perhaps. I came back from that, it was my first trip to Southeast Asia. I took another 2-week vacation, I took another 3-week vacation, and then belatedly I thought, well, why am I sitting in a cubicle in New York City writing second-hand reports of the world when I could be loose in these magical places that I've been visiting? And so the only way I could free myself from the job was to concoct this pretext for an escape. And so I managed to sell a publisher on the notion that I would travel around Asia and write a very speedy book about it. And I took a 6-month leave of absence. And of course, in the course of completing 4 months of travel around 10 countries in Asia, I realized there was no going back. And so that really is how I freed myself to go to Japan. And as Don was saying, having been working 4 blocks from Times Square for 4 years, I thought, well, the perfect complement is a monastery in Kyoto, which was the perfect answer for a week. My year in the monastery lasted a week. And now I think travel mostly is a big adventure at my desk. In other words, I've always been less interested in travel than transport, you could say, or transformation. And that for me happens more when I'm sitting in one place, when I'm loose in the world, maybe because I've been lucky enough to see quite a bit of the world in the last 40, 45 years. I grew up in a somewhat unusual way because I was going to school by plane from the age of 9. And so because of that, I think travel in itself was never very interesting to me. It was my second nature. It was like taking a bus from here to Larkspur. But as a means to writing, and as a means to slipping away from corporate offices and into a more unlicensed life, it was ideal. So these days I'm hungering for adventure, but only sitting in my desk in this boring suburb of Nara, Japan. I mean, I think for me travel is really about looking around the corner, never being able to anticipate what comes next, not being able to take anything for granted. Most of all, having wide eyes. And I think we all know that you can have wide eyes in your backyard. I just travel around Corte Madera and imagine you're seeing it through the eyes of somebody who's just arrived from Tibet. Or my taxi driver who just brought me over, who's from the Ukraine. Suddenly the world you think you know becomes something different. So I don't think travel for me has really ever had much to do with physical movement, so much as with opening one's senses to what's around one. So actually I did a little book for TED, the title of which was meant to be Going Nowhere. They had the sense to change it, but the subtitle was Adventures in Going Nowhere, and this book that Don is carrying is essentially a book about going nowhere and nothing happening. I'll make it sound as seductive and exciting as possible. Because it's just 26 years of living in the most anonymous, generic, Western-style suburb in Japan, and how that can be as magical as traveling to Tibet.
Right. And I do feel that travel for you is in the reflection. And this is the actual act of travel, but then what really happens, the real travel takes place when you're back and you're at your desk, reflecting on it.
Yeah, that's perfectly said. I think of movement and experience and travel, just as you say, it's like going to a farmer's market, gathering lots and lots of ingredients, fresh and sometimes exotic. And then the desk is where you put them together and make the meal. It's where you take experience and try to turn it into meaning. Or you take the many sights that you've acquired and try to turn it into insights. But as you say, that all happens when the physical journey is over. And when you're thinking, what did I see in Iran that can change my life here in California or Japan? What is it that I noticed when I was walking the streets of Paris that I can incorporate into my daily life to make it more enchanted? You must feel the same.
I do.
Yeah. You're just off the plane from Greece.
I am just off the plane from Greece. Via Japan, it feels like.
Yes.
Right.
What surprised you most when you were going back to Greece after many years?
Right. Oh God. Well, how little it had changed.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
Because all the headlines, everything you hear about Greece is the crisis and
Yes.
everything they've gone through and how depressed the country must be. And you go there and in the plaza at 10 o'clock at night, people are just showing up for dinner and they're sitting down and everyone's drinking and eating and talking and doing this with their hands. And before too long, they're kind of doing this with their hands. And it's Greece. It's the Greece I lived 40 years ago. And it didn't feel like it had changed at all.
It's the Greece Homer lived in, actually, I think.
It is the Greece Homer lived in,
Yeah.
right.
I mean, yesterday, I did a piece for the New York Times that was in yesterday's paper about how the charm of Greece is that it's so undeveloped, so un-European. No wonder its economy is sinking, because it feels like it's very much the Greece of 2,500 years ago, where the shepherd's son is leading the young woman under the olive trees, and the women in black are chattering, and there's a protection against the evil eye, the superstitions are alive and well, and the whitewashed church is tolling in the background, and it's amazing how little it's been touched by the modern world.
Truly.
And I think, that may be the prejudice or the romance of travelers, because I know when I go to Japan, I have an investment in believing that nothing has changed there in the 32 years I've been. I don't know, you actually have two great disadvantages. One is you speak Japanese, unlike me, and the second is you got to Japan 9 years before I did. But do you think it's changed a lot in the time you've been there?
Superficially, yes.
Exactly.
Somewhat socially, but quintessentially, no.
Yeah.
I don't think so. And especially I go to Shikoku, which really hasn't changed.
It's true.
Really
Yes.
hasn't changed.
Yes.
In Kyoto, yes, probably in some ways. But still, the spirit, I don't think the spirit has really changed much at all.
No. No, I think when you meet an 8-year-old grandmother, you can see the spark of mischief of the 8-year-old girl
Right.
inside her in most cases.
Yeah.
She's got wrinkles, her hair is grey, but she's
Right.
fundamentally the same person.
Right.
And especially with such an old and deep-rooted culture like Japan. I sometimes think the more it changes on the surface, the less it changes deep down.
Right.
And it's, in fact, deliberately taking in everything from around the world so as to remain entirely, irreparably Japanese
Right.
at its heart.
Right. Right. It's subtly transforming a little bit as it takes things in, but generally absorbing those things into its Japaneseness rather
Yes.
than losing
Yes.
its Japanese.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I was talking to Michael Krasny this morning, and I suddenly remembered how the wartime emperor in Japan, who came into power in 1926 and ruled till 1989, 30 years after the war, he was asked, what has changed in your lifetime? And he said, pre-war, post-war, basically the same. And we think of the transformation of Japan after the war as one of the greatest changes in the modern world. But from his point of view, seeing things on a larger canvas of millennia, nothing's changed. I think that the great novel by Tanizaki, the Makioka sisters, 530 pages, constant eventfulness, and the last sentence is more or less nothing ever changes.
Right.
It's a Japanese way of thinking of things, whether or not it's the case.
Yeah.
But because of the cycle of seasons, it's constantly turning. So life isn't moving forwards, and there isn't an illusion of progress. There's more the sense.
Right.
Autumn is the first step towards spring, and spring is bringing us closer to autumn.
Right.
And,
Right.
yeah.
Which
No,
is still so incredibly powerful in Japan, that sense of that continuity and the cyclicity of things,
Yes.
cyclicalness.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of it as the religion of Japan.
Mm.
And I think people, certainly you know better than I, how when the maple leaves are blazing in late November, all my neighbors put on their finest clothes and they flock out into the gardens and the parks.
Right.
And I think they're doing that much as people here traditionally went to church.
Right.
And they want to be joined in a congregation.
Right.
They want to be reminded these forces much larger than we are.
Yeah.
They want to see the light amidst the coming darkness. And it's really an act of worship. They are bowing before the seasons, because the seasons are what are teaching them about changelessness and change.
Right,
And
exactly.
everything is shifting every second, and deep down the river is remaining the same while the
Right.
water's moving.
Right.
So,
The impermanence, the permanence of impermanence.
yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the one thing you can count on.
Right. So this is a beautiful, beautiful book, and it's set in Nara,
Yeah.
which is actually a place I was a month ago,
I'm
because
envious.
twice a year I take these GeoX trips in the spring to Kyoto, Nara, and Shikoku. and every year we go to Nara, and every year I say, this is where the great Pico Iyer lives. But I've never known exactly where you live, and now I know exactly where you live. So
Too much.
when a
yes.
little tour bus shows up on your doorstep, I'll say, Pico-san!
That's true, there's a map of our
There's a map in here. You might want to rethink that when you do the next edition. But so anyway, it's so fun to go to Nara, and I imagine you being there, and I kind of imagine your life there. Now I really have a much better sense of your life there, which is wonderful. But I wanted to ask you to talk about your first, how you fell in love with Japan, that first encounter you had, and what that was all about. You do describe it a bit in the book, but for everybody's
Yes.
wonderment,
You've
talk about that.
probably heard it much too often.
No, I never tire of hearing it.
Oh, thank you. So while I was working in Time magazine, as I was saying, I made my first trip ever to Southeast Asia. And I spent 3 weeks in Thailand and Burma, and each day was more wondrous than the day before. And it was as if a whole world had been thrown open of romance and mystery and ritual and things I'd never even imagined growing up in England and then spending time in Santa Barbara. And at the end of it, I had a week in Hong Kong amidst the sort of glittery skyscrapers and then the casinos of Macau. And finally, after this 4-week life-changing journey, I had to fly back to my job in New York City. And I was flying on Japan Airlines, and I had a layover at Narita Airport near Tokyo. Last thing I wanted to be back looking at my photos, sharing my stories with my friends. I had to spend that 20 hours in Narita. And all of you know airport towns. You've been to Millbrae, you've been to Burlingame, you've probably been to Inglewood and Queens. They're not known as centers of fascination and beauty. But I was stuck there. And I had to kill 5 hours before getting on my plane. So I thought, what am I going to do? And I saw a little sign in the lobby offering a free shuttle bus into the town of Narita. And I thought, well, there's nothing else to do. I'm sure I'll never be back in Japan again, so let me take this bus. And it took me in through extremely modern avenues of high-rises and concrete buildings and dropped me off near a bridge. I went across the bridge, and suddenly I was in this much more narrow, intimate space. All the buildings were wooden, and there were shoes laid out perfectly at the entrance, and through the windows I could see the flashes of gold and scarlet from the beginning of autumn. Nobody was there, it was very, very quiet. And I followed a riddle of lanes to this large white pebble courtyard where there was a meditation hall. In my ignorance, I didn't know it was one of the great temples of Japan, 1,000 years old, and in fact such an important pilgrimage spot that people would walk 46 miles from central Tokyo to be there. And so I went, and it was my first experience of a Japanese Buddhist meditation hall, and I followed the hall round to Temple Garden. And it was late October, which means in Japan, brilliant blue skies, but the first pinch of the coming cold and dark. And I saw these 5-year-old kids in pink and blue hats scattering around the lawn, gathering acorns on some kindergarten expedition. And as I looked across that, I thought, I know this place. I know this place better than I know the street I grew up on in Oxford, England. I know it better than my apartment in New York City. If I don't come back here, something in me is always going to be unresolved. And I will feel, as Thoreau said, that I've died without ever having lived. So I can't afford to turn away from this invitation. And by the time I boarded my flight, 3 hours later, I decided to move to Japan on the basis of one morning in an airport town. And it took me 3 years to extricate myself from my job, but I did, and it's really one decision I've never regretted. I've been there 32 years now, and I hope to spend as much of the rest of my life there as I can. And I suppose one reason I describe it here is just my sense that all of us have secret homes. And I think many of you, the way that you'll step into a crowded room like this, and you'll meet a stranger, and you'll feel, I know her. I actually know her better than the friends and the family I came with. There's some connection that we need to explore. And I think we all have that relation to places too, usually very ancient places. People magnetically are drawn or feel at home in India, China, Mexico, Egypt. And I'm notorious for my discomfort with technology, but I've got to say, thanks to technology, now people, all of us in this room, can visit our secret homes, and even, in my case, live in the place that makes sense to me. I've been there for 32 years on a tourist visa, so all my bosses are still in New York and London, but I can correspond with my bosses very easily and with my friends over here while still living in the place that seems to be on my wavelength. Or I always feel if I can understand Japan a little better, I'll be able to understand myself. And we all have those places, and some of us are lucky enough to find them. So that was my first encounter with Japan, and it's never got less magical. So 23 years after that first taste in Narita, I had a wonderful itinerary in January 2009 when I was going to Beijing, Varanasi, Mauritius, Jaipur, and Sri Lanka. All magical places, job related, as I told myself, but actually pure delight. And yet, I arrived, I had a layover again, Narita Airport, January 3rd, and New Year is particularly buoyant time in Japan because the whole country stops and everyone, again, floods into the temples to mark the New Year and to gather fortunes for the year to come. And of all the places I visited in those 5 weeks, Narita was unquestionably the highlight. So that confirmed the intuition I already had.
Really?
How did you first come to Japan?
My fellowship.
But I mean, your first day and...
Oh.
Were you drawn to Japan before the fellowship?
Yes,
Okay.
somehow.
Oh,
But I
there
had
we
no
go.
idea how.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure I've told you this before, but I hardly understood the difference between China and Japan.
Right.
I was kind of, I think they're two different countries. But I felt that Japan was, I won this fellowship and I got to choose where I wanted to go, and I thought Japan was probably the most modern of the Asian countries that I could go to.
Yeah.
That was pretty much it. Little did I know what awaited me there. What wonderful things awaited me there. And it took me 6 months of feeling uncomfortable. Not being able to read anything, not being able to speak, not quite understanding how the culture operated. And then one morning, 6 months into my stay, which was 2 years, I just woke up and it was magically, everything had fallen into place somehow overnight. And I just felt like, I get it. And I think what had happened was I surrendered. I kept trying to impose my own sense of order and understanding on Japan. I don't get it, I don't get it, I don't get it. And I think then one night I just kind of went, okay, I don't get it. And then the next morning I was like, I get it. It was all about surrender.
You're ahead of me, because the longer I've been there, the more I feel I don't get it. I don't get it. Going backwards. But I know what you mean about imposing those ideas. I always think it's like eating noodles with a knife and fork. In other words, if we bring our Western analytical ideas to Japan, it's just not going to hold. Nothing is going to compute.
Exactly.
And I loved what you said about how you were drawn to it because it was the most modern place. Because there's nowhere more fashion crazy and more up to the moment than Japan on the surface. And nowhere less transformed. Deep down, I was saying to somebody maybe yesterday, I think of Japan as a very old wise man in a Planet Hollywood t-shirt. He always wears the latest fashion, he's always clued into what's going on, but he's still an old man. And underneath that t-shirt, he's not part of the global network whatsoever. And I think the zany modern things are what hit one on first arrival. And then you realize that almost everything is beyond our grasp. So you mentioned where I live, as represented in the map in this book, it essentially looks like Redwood City. It's a completely modern suburb. All the buildings are Western style, all the streets are straight. Main drags, literally called School Dory, Park Dory, using the English names. But, as Don was suggesting, it's in the outskirts of Nara, which was the capital in the year 710. And the center of Nara is nothing but the largest municipal park in the whole of Japan. All temples, shrines, reflecting ponds, sutra houses, 1,200 wild deer who are meant to be God's messengers, walking around essentially the rulers of the place. And that's exactly my image of Japan, which is this synthetic, Western-looking suburb of somewhere deep and ancient and filled with spirits, ruled by spirits still. So modernity has happily remained on the surface there.
Yeah, absolutely. We go to Nara on our trip, we go to the deer park, we watch the deer. The deer are very comical, very interesting.
Yes.
Then we go to the big Buddha temple, Todaiji, which is one of the most amazing, one, structures, and two, I mean, the Buddha is just incredible. And then we go to the Kasuga Shrine, which is right next door, which is one of the oldest Shinto shrines in Japan. And one of the things I love about it is it shows how Shinto and Buddhism coexist so peacefully and so amiably, generally speaking.
Yes.
And that's a really wonderful thing. I mean, this incredibly old animist religion,
Yes.
maybe the only certified animist religion in the world right now,
Yes.
Shinto, and Buddhism, which came later and sort of came on top of it, but they managed to get along so well, and I love the geographical proximity of that. And then you just get this one fell swoop sense of Nara, the old 8th century capital, and how it still is not that different today from probably what it was before. And you mentioned the storehouse where the Silk Road objects are kept.
Yes.
It's really extraordinary. It's a lesson in and of itself.
Yes, I think when people dream of Kyoto, it's actually Nara they're seeing.
Right.
Kyoto is a much more built-up city, more populous than Detroit and more crowded in parts, though much more magical. But as you say about Shinto and Buddhism, yeah, it's a wonderful arranged marriage. For example, the deer are Shinto spirits because a deity was seen riding over the hills in the 8th century on a white deer. So for Shinto, they're divine. But of course, when my neighbors look at the deer, they remember the Buddha's first sermon in the deer park. And I think with the seasons too, because Shinto would say trees and rivers and flowers all have kami-sama, have spirits inside them. And in Buddhism, the trees are the transmitters of the laws of impermanence and the fact that nothing remains the same. So, and I think one of the beautiful things, it's like the religion of autumn is powerful because it has no dogmas. Shinto has no texts, no doctrines, so there can't be any arguments. It's a fact of life. Either you buy into it or you don't. And certainly Buddhism as it's practiced in Japan is not about arguments and not about texts.
Right.
It's about living with reality. And reality differently conceived, because it's still startling to me that in Japan, this glass has a soul, this bottle has a spirit. I shouldn't even touch that table because it's like touching another person, and I need to bring respect to it. Many of you will have seen the anime movies of Miyazaki, Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke and Wind Rises, and as you remember, it's all about that every blade of grass has a soul, and he's trying to restore that Shinto vision to a country that he's worried is losing contact with it. And Marie Kondo, the great decluttering guru, it's Shinto, because really what she's saying is, ask your clothes if they're sparking joy. Many of us in Santa Barbara don't have conversations with other people, but in Japan they do, because they're animate. So when people are so surprised that robots officiate over weddings in Japan, and that's not because the Japanese happy to be officiated over by inanimate things, is because robots are animate in Japan, and they have a spirit, and so, you know, Pico or Don were to officiate over a wedding or a robot, there wouldn't necessarily be a difference in the Japanese wedding.
Right?
Yeah. In an American way of thinking, there might not be a difference either,
Right,
different,
right.
yeah, different way of thinking.
At one point in the book, Hiroko-san talks about how when she was young, she would like kick a table or
Right.
something, and she would have to, or the parents would say, apologize to the table.
Exactly, exactly.
Oh, I'm sorry, table. I
Yeah.
just kicked her.
Yes, and her father would say, what has the table done to hurt you?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, it's true.
It's like kicking your brother to kick the table,
Right.
he would have
It
said.
gives you a reverence for everything. You take
Yes.
things more seriously and more responsibly.
That's right. I mean, a lot of people when they visit Japan are so surprised that you buy a 75-cent eclair, and the woman at the convenience store almost bows before the eclair, and she wraps it up, and then she puts it in a box, and then she puts ice so that it won't melt, and then she seals the box, and then she puts a sticker on, and treats it as reverently as if it were caviar. But as you said, it's a living thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people do the same with their lives, which I really appreciate. The man sweeping the temple garden with the twig broom
Yes.
is very dignified and proud of what he's doing, and he takes his role incredibly seriously,
Yes.
because this is what he does in life.
Yes,
I mean, this
yes.
is, it's like the table. You honor yourself the same way you honor the table, and the person cleaning the floor in the restaurant, or the person taking tickets at the subway station. They're all immersed in this sense of pride. This is what they do, and they're
Yes.
going to do it as well as they possibly can.
Yes.
And I always love that in Japan, and I always point it out to travelers because it feels so different to me from the United States, where a lot of people feel like they're stuck in their jobs and they don't really care what kind of a job they do, and they just want to get home. And in Japan, you get that sense of, I'm here for 9 hours, I'm going to make this the best 9 hours I can.
And you are your job. You are
You
what
are
you
your
do
job,
rather than
exactly.
what you are. Because I think the whole
Yeah,
notion of
that's true.
who you are in Japan, it's a
Right.
great land of individualists, but not necessarily of individuals.
Right.
And so, for example, when I was in Time Magazine, I was chafing against a job because I thought I'm bigger or better than this job. But in
Right.
Japan, you are your job, and that's actually the greatest compliment you could receive.
Right.
That's, yes.
Yeah.
And a sense of responsibility, because I think that man sweeping is aware that 3,000 people will be walking through that courtyard
Right.
today, and this is how he makes the experience that much more spotless, immaculate
Right.
for them.
Right.
And somebody was asking me, how has living in Japan changed you? And I was recalling that when I walk down the street in my neighborhood in Japan, I reflexively pick up the trash. I've never done that in New York City or Santa Barbara. But it's because you feel that there's no you there, you're just part of this network.
Right.
And your obligation is really to everyone around you, rather than
Exactly.
advancing your own agenda.
Right. It's all about harmony, interconnectedness,
Yes.
interdependence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, which actually goes to the other really essential theme of this book, which is, of course, ping pong. Half the book is about ping pong and how that was my way to learn about being in a Japanese circle. And as just as Don was saying, when I first arrived at the ping pong group, I was so surprised that our game's the best of two. So there's no loser, usually. And we change pairs every 5 minutes. So if you do lose, you'll likely win 6 minutes later. And we only play doubles. We never play singles. And if you're a very good player, you use your skill to turn a 9-1 lead into a 9-9 tie. In other words, all your attention is on ensuring that as many people as possible are feeling happy about that. And you never exult about after a victory, and in fact you're not really trying to win a victory, except insofar as many people as possible can feel that they're winners. It's not in this book. I actually have a second book on Japan coming out in September, and in that I mention how when the first American went over to manage a professional baseball team in Japan, Bobby Valentine, in 1995, he took this really mediocre squad and he led them to the stunning second place finish. He was instantly fired. And quite a few foreign journalists were taken aback, so they went to the team spokesman and said, "What's with that? He had such a good season. Why did you fire him?" Back came the answer, because of his emphasis on winning. And I think here, winning is seen as a good thing. In Japan, maybe not, because it's a disruption of that harmony. You're winning at the expense of somebody, and you're not really necessarily being attuned to the larger obligations of a society that works like a symphony orchestra and doesn't have soloists.
Right, exactly. Right, exactly. I always tell the story about the American who hit a Grand Slam home run in the bottom of the ninth, soon after arriving in Japan, won the game for his team, and did as he would in the United States, sort of threw his bat down and did this, and started running around the bases like this, and the whole audience was stunned into silence. Everybody was just looking at it, what is going on? And you know what the Japanese person in the same situation would do is they'd put their bat down politely, they'd trot around the bases diligently,
Yes.
and then when they got to home plate, the whole team would come out and they would celebrate together.
Yes. And throw the umpire, the manager in the air.
Throw the manager in the air,
3
right?
times, yes.
Because the team hit the home run.
Yes, yes,
That single player
Yes.
didn't hit the home run.
yes.
The team hit the home run. And that's so shocking to me. I mean, it's just so striking. And what you just said about Valentine is really, really interesting. They fired him.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it must be said that Japanese baseball fans will make those Warrior fans over there seem quiet and subdued by comparison. And I strongly recommend, even if you're not interested in baseball, to go to a baseball game when you're in Japan. Because you'll see the Japanese people there, in my experience, are as warm and boisterous and welcoming as they are shy and reticent in other aspects of life. And when you go there as a foreigner, you are part of the team, just as Don was saying. And so, you know, men dressed from head to toe as tigers will envelop you in a bear hug. Grandmothers who might otherwise be scared of seeing foreigners will offer you their dried octopus. But certainly you are part of the community when you're rooting for the tigers or the swallows or whatever.
Yes.
They're very boisterous. They put
They're very
Fenway Park
boisterous.
and Yankee Stadium to shame.
Syncopated boisterous.
Yes, exactly. And they have a special dance for every single batter who comes up to the plate, and special music, and they perform the dance en masse for the duration of his time at the plate, every time he comes up to the 9 innings. Right? No exaggeration. And then, for example, the Yakult Swallows, every time there's a home run, all 20,000 Yakult Swallow fans on cue open up blue umbrellas. What it signifies, I don't know, but it's a celebration.
All right. The Warriors could do something with that.
Yes.
So I did want to ask you how the idea for this book first took seed and how it sort of grew.
Shrank.
Shrank.
Shrank, truly. I mean, that's an embarrassing story. Again, I was telling some people in the East Bay yesterday. So this is a very small book. It took me 16 years to write it. And it took me 16 years to make it as small as it is. Because it's a book about absences, and it's a book about silences. And I wanted to be true to that Japanese aesthetic of taking everything out. In Japan, if you have 30 things arranged on the table, the art is to take 28 of them away, and then the last 2 are charged, as is the space between them. And so we have our apartment is maybe half the size of this room, and we have one closet, and I was saying yesterday I have maybe 8,000 pages of notes, because I have transcribed every day I've been in Japan for 32 years. Every encounter, every moment, everything I've overheard, I have a lot to do. And so every day I would take out 20 pages of notes, and I'd annotate them and organize them and see where they fit in a narrative. And then I'd go to the grocery store to buy a tangerine, and I'd come back with 24 pages of new notes of observations and vignettes I had to include. So really moving backwards successfully for a long, long time. But I wanted the resonance and the clarity of the empty room. That's, since you all know, especially in the Bay Area, you have a lot of tatami spaces, and when you go into a traditional Japanese room, there's just one vase there, one scroll there. You bring all your attention to it, and you see the whole world inside each one of them. And so all my time was spent taking things out and seeing how much I could remove, so that, as in a haiku, the silences would speak and the spaces between the lines. And you were asking about Video Night in Kathmandu, and I was remembering yesterday, I wrote that whole book in 3 months, and it's 370 pages. So I was a young kid who felt I had to throw everything into every sentence. And here, this is half as long, and it took me 16 years, because I was telling somebody, my mind is kind of like a Bollywood stage set in overdrive, you know, singing, dancing, brightest colours. And so it's really a challenge to keep everything out. And that was the interesting challenge for this book. It's all of you have had the experience, I'm sure, of going into a loved one's room, and she's not there, and you see a strand of hair, and a postcard, and a letter she's writing, and she comes home to you, all her vulnerability, her hopes, her longings, her innocence, in a way she wouldn't if she were just standing in front of you talking. And so I was trying to get that aesthetic of the empty room, which is charged with a presence. And again, it's a book about, it begins with my father-in-law's death. And whenever anyone dies in your family, you know they're all around you, perhaps more so than when they were living. And so I was trying to create these empty scenes. I kept all drama, all eventfulness, all bull-type moments out of this book, to try to catch just the quiet flow of a neighborhood, which is really where true life takes place, behind all the dramas. So it really took me an inordinate amount of time. At one point while I was writing this book, I found 120 pages I'd written of this very book I'd completely forgotten about.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So yes, when you so kindly say how it took sprout and grew, it was much more a case of bringing it, yes, precisely. That's right, like a bonsai, actually.
Right, exactly.
Yes, yeah.
It's like a haiku.
Yes, yes.
So, in the haiku, there's the ping pong, which is a really interesting counterpart. And
Yes.
was that, you didn't always play ping pong, as I recall. You started playing ping pong a little bit after you got to Japan.
That's right.
But so when did ping pong become part of the narrative for you, or part of the story?
More than 16 years ago. So it was always a feature of this book. So right across from the street in our boring suburban neighborhood, there used to be a health club. And every night, every morning, when she had a day off, my wife would wake up very early and put on headband and leggings and go off for 8 hours. Jazzercise, weight training, high intensity aerobics, kickboxing, yoga, you name it. And I would be completely comatose at home, feeling exhausted just thinking about it. But because she's Japanese, she's graced with patience. And so 17 years after we met, she came back one day and said, oh, you know, they're offering ping pong now in the health club. Gentle hint. And I snarled something dismissive. She said, didn't you used to play ping pong as a kid? Well, yeah, that's 30 years ago. But I finally agreed to go and inspect the ping pong, and within 3 minutes, as she'd feared, I was goner for life. So it was my first taste of watching how Japan operates. And I was thinking also yesterday, one of the great beauties of the ping pong club for me was meeting a group of Japanese men, because for foreigners it's very easy, as both of us have found, to make contact with Japanese women, young and old, because sad to say they're still really relegated to second-class citizen status. And so they feel a natural affiliation with foreigners. They're offered very little scope in the public domain, and so they have a lot to gain by even marrying foreigners. I'm the beneficiary of a restless Japanese woman who thought I need to escape, however I can, even by marrying a scruffy Indian unemployed guy. For so long, my notion of Japanese men were these guys yawning in three-piece suits at 6 in the morning at the bus stop across the street and barking at convenience store workers. And as I saw it, turning their backs on their wives and children to support them economically, but in no way emotionally. But in a ping pong club, these are all retired men, so they're free at last of their responsibilities, and they're dancing around like little kids, and they're as irresistible as 6-year-old boys, and just having the time of their life, and very, very good grandfathers, having never really had the chance to be fathers. And as I spent time with them, I suddenly worked out, oh, most of these people were born in the 1930s. So they came of age during a war, and then 7 years of harrowing occupation. Then they joined Mitsubishi and Sony and Toyota, and they created what we used to call the Japanese miracle. But finally, they had the chance to be themselves after all this time. So ping pong really opened the door for me to 50% of the Japanese populace that I would never otherwise have met. And my notion was, many of you must have seen Midsummer Night's Dream, and there are courtiers and kings and queens and goddesses enacting a lofty rise to the top, but there are also the so-called rude mechanicals who are there for comical effect. And I wanted the ping pong, because a lot of this book is about sadness and death, and how do we throw our arms around a loved one knowing that she's not going to be there forever. And so to complement that, I wanted ping pong as a reminder that in the midst of a reality that is in certain respects sad, because every life ends in death and every meeting ends in a separation, there is this completely guileless sense of gaiety and merriment that continues in the midst of everything, even among people who in their 70s and 80s, including my friends, in fact especially among them. And it was important for me in a book about death to have a lot of humor, lightheartedness, to remind us that the fact of death is actually the reason to enjoy beauty and wonder right now, and in fact to play ping pong. And also, I guess, ping pong for me was a way of thinking about writing. Some of you may have read Haruki Murakami's book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Running, and what he talks about when he talks about running is writing. The whole book is about how to be a writer. And ping pong, in the sense that there are no winners or losers, but it's an exercise you do for fun, to clear your head, and to step out of your life for a while, the better to return to it. And that's how my life at the desk is, pretty much. It doesn't really matter what comes out of it, it's the game.
I wanted to ask, did you change as you wrote the book? And now that I know it took you decades to write the book, or did writing the book change you?
I don't know how much I changed. I mean, gained weight, lost hair. And therefore exemplified the theme of the book, which is each autumn is the same autumn, but I'm 1 year closer to oblivion. Or to decrepitude, at least. So in that sense, I did. But at some level, not. Because I wrote a book about Japan my first year there, which was 31 years ago. And it was really framed by 2 autumns. And the subtitle of that book was 4 Seasons in Kyoto. So already my arrival in Japan told me seasons are the framework within which everything happens. This is what is really drawing me to Japan. Even though I lived in New England for 4 years and New York for 4 years, and the fall is rightly resplendent there, I'd never been attuned to the seasons and never thought of them as a teacher and an instructor about life and impermanence until I got to Japan. So in those ways, that the seeds, to use your perfect phrase, were there even 32 years ago. But because I'd written about 4 seasons in Kyoto, I wanted this book to be 1 season in the suburbs. Because Kyoto is an instantly exotic, fascinating, beautiful place. But how do you find beauty in the suburbs, which are just a poor replica of a Californian suburb? That's the challenge. And so that first book was about falling in love, and this book is about staying in love. And it's easy to fall in love and to enjoy the giddiness of a honeymoon period. But how do you make a marriage last for, in this case, 32 years? And that has to do with finding the beauty in the ordinary, rather than being drawn by the magnificence of Kyoto temples and this uniquely sophisticated city. So it was important for me to have the contrast between the excited arrival in this tremendous city and just the day-to-day life of nothing happening in a completely indifferent, neutral suburb. And it seemed to me that that was one of the things I could learn from Japan, which is to find beauty in nothing happening.
Yeah, because of course nothing happens on so many layers.
It's everything happening, exactly.
Right.
That's right. One of my models in this book was the movies of Ozu. Many of you know the great Japanese director in the 1950s, Tokyo Story and Late Spring. And everyone in his books really says nothing and, oh, really? Is that right? And then the neighbor looks in, hello, hello, and then a train passes, and then that's the end. Except the train is taking your daughter away and you'll never see her again. And the neighbor who's just looked in is suffering from cancer. And the person who says, is that right, actually is hearing about his wife's death. And then, when everyone's left the scene, the camera just fixes on the empty room. And that's when the emotion really comes in. Because you're not distracted by talk and moving characters. And just the empty room is charged, and the camera is absolutely still, and just surveying the room. The way I think classically certain Japanese people would see, now a tsunami is happening, now a grandchild is born, now it's spring again, season of exaltation, now it's winter and people are fading away. But it's still camera at tatami level. It's kind of what this book is about. And then always in the Ozu movies, there's a sound of a festival outside, of somebody weeping in the room next door. And so this book, that's where the ping pong comes in. It's the festival that plays off against the sound of a stifled sob.
Yeah, that's beautiful. The ping pong is kind of Shakespearean to me somehow. It seems.
Good. You're the perfect reader. No one else would see that or say that. That's what I had in my mind.
Must have been the sake I was drinking as I was reading.
Well, of course, the great difference between writing and ping pong is community. And as a solitary writer who's an only child who grew up in airplanes, I was really happy to go to Japan to try to learn what it is to be a larger circle, and in fact not even to be an eye, to just be one amidst 29 interchangeable units, as is the case in the ping pong club. Nobody's even aware of, we use yarrow sticks to pick who's playing with whom, and whether you're Dawn or Pico or an older lady, it's all immaterial. You're my partner for now. So the communal aspect of the ping pong was the complement to the solitary reflections, maybe.
Yeah, one of the things I love about this is you talk about an empty room and the silence.
Yes.
And the layers of silence that I felt on many pages. That beneath the actual physical page I was reading, there was a kind of a depth, almost like a pool at the bottom that a pebble was dropping into. But it felt like that when I was reading the book, and you're attuned to those silences so beautifully, and you kind of draw them out without drawing attention to them.
Gosh, well thank you. You are the dream reader, and you know Japan well enough to see. It was the 8,000 pages simmering beneath the 200. It really was. That's why I was removing it, so that the silence, you feel everything that's underneath it. and it didn't have to be said. And that's how Japanese communication works, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
The fewer words are expressed, the deeper the feeling.
Yeah,
Words only divert, diffuse, and distract.
right,
Silence brings us together.
right. Words are superficial, it's what's...
Yes. And you were talking about harmony.
Mm,
Silence is what creates harmony, and music perhaps.
right,
Words, not always.
yeah. So this book was like an accompaniment through all of your years in Japan, in a way?
I guess I've been taking notes through all my years in Japan, and 16 years ago was when I decided I should start writing a book. And then I wrote this simultaneous book called A Beginner's Guide to Japan, which will come out at the end of the summer. That's absolutely contradictory. So in this book, I'm trying...
A Beginner's Guide to Japan?
Yes. So that's where I cover baseball games, fashion, history, love hotels.
Oh, great.
Yes. Everything.
That'll be fun to read in conjunction with this.
Yes. So this book is meant to be almost, I was trying to get Japan speaking unmediated to the world. Japan just talking to us. And the other book is us talking back to Japan.
Right.
How an outsider feels when you suddenly arrive at Tokyo airport and everything is reversed. You dial 119 instead of 911 for an emergency. You go to the baseball stadium and you hear about 2 and 3 counts instead of 3 and 2. The restaurants advertise we're open from 9 o'clock to 25 o'clock. You haven't heard of 25 o'clock. You go to Kyoto Station and there's platform 31, platform 32, platform 0. And every foreigner since the 16th century has noticed how everything is reversed, upside down, topsy-turvy in Japan. So it's a little bit about, it's more about comparing Japan with the rest of the world, and the many ways in which Japan chooses or insists on being different now. Whereas this is a book about how Japan is indistinguishable from us, because the central action of this book is in the first scene I hear about my father-in-law's death. And then I'm worried about my mother-in-law, who's been married for 60 years and is 86 and is suddenly in a nursing home. And I'm thinking about my brother-in-law, who lives 15 minutes away and needs to sign the will, but who cut off the entire family 25 years ago, so nobody has even seen him. I've never met my brother-in-law for 32 years. And those kind of things you would find even, dare I say it, in Corte Madera or London or Paris. In other words, that's the universal family dynamic, which has nothing to do with Japan, even though the forms it takes may be Japanese. So I deliberately set it in a Western-style neighborhood with a family drama to say Japan isn't so different from us. Every one of us recognizes these kind of stories. And probably many of you in this room are thinking about exactly what my neighbors are thinking about, which is, should we send our mother to a nursing home and feel really guilty? Should we keep her at home and feel really frazzled? What do we do with the fact our spouse is getting older and older? And would we rather die before our spouse or actually have to be alone in her or his absence? So those things are not at all unique to Japan, probably. I wanted to bring Japan as close to us as possible because it's so easy to mystify or romanticize it.
Yeah. It's a very tender love letter of the book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I have a million more questions for you, but I'm sure people in the audience do too, so I'm going to open the floor up. But before I do that, I'm wondering if you would grace us with a reading from the book.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Do you mind?
No, thank you. Actually, I can think of a reading now. I used to come to this bookshop every few months, as I said, and it really became a part of my life. And because writers don't tour, and because it took me 16 years to finish this, I haven't been here for 11 years. And the last time I was on this stage, I was here with a kind of travel book about the Dalai Lama called The Open Road. So maybe I'll end with this scene. Every November the Dalai Lama comes to Japan, and every November my wife and I travel across Japan with him. So this won't take too long. And this is a scene in which we visit him in Kyoto and we remember a trip we had taken with him 2 years earlier. As we say hello to the Dalai Lama, I recall the November day 2 years ago when we traveled up with him to a fishing village north of Tokyo, laid waste by the tsunami of 8 months earlier. A few miles out of the city of Sendai, we began passing along clean, modern roads lined by nothing but compacted trash, block-long rectangles of smashed cars and refuse, telephone poles listed at 45-degree angles, A solitary chair sat in the open skeleton of what had once been a living room. Buses bobbed on the water beside us. When we pulled up at Ishinomaki, hundreds had gathered along the road there behind ropes to greet the famous visitor. It was to see nothing but a flattened landscape, which looked like pictures I'd seen of Hiroshima after the bomb. More than 3,000 had lost their lives in this village alone, many of them children. 19,000 had lost their homes. The Dalai Lama stepped out of his car and strode without hesitation to the people, mostly women, who'd assembled in the street to see him. Many were sobbing or calling out in limited English, "Thank you, thank you." He held one person's head against his chest. He blessed another. He touched heads, shook hands, looked into one set of eyes, then another, asking, "What do you feel? Are you still sad?" "Please," he told them, as the women sobbed and others pushed forwards, "please, be brave. Please change your hearts. You cannot change what has happened. Please help everyone else. Help others become okay." The crowd fell quiet. Some of its members nodded. "Too many people died," he went on. "If you worry, it can't help them. Please, work hard. That is the best offering you can make to the ones you lost. Rebuild your community as your country rebuilt itself after the war." It's the kind of advice that anyone might give, perhaps. But when he turned around to walk towards the temple that had survived, gravestones in the foreground tilted crazily over or knocked down entirely, I saw the Dalai Lama take off his glasses and wipe away a tear himself. Suffering is the central fact of life from his Buddhist viewpoint. It's what we do with it that defines our lives. Just one day later, we return with the Dalai Lama and his bodyguards to his hotel, hasten up in the elevator to the top floor, and walk at high speed down the corridor with him to his room. His eyes are often red after a long day of events, but his pace never slackens. He's holding Hyoko's hand as he moves forward, as in some physical expression of his teachings. He reflexively reaches for any set of hands to grasp between his own as he strides along. Just before we arrive at his door, Hyoko says, "Your Holiness, we must leave you now, but thank you for everything." He's on his way to Tokyo next day. We have obligations at home. "Also," she says, and her voice begins to falter a little, "I want to tell you, my father passed away this year." Instantly, the fast-stepping monk stops. He looks at her directly. "When?" "This year." "What cause?" "No cause. He was old. His body was tired." He steps forward and holds her for a long, long time. Then he steps back and looks searchingly at her. "Remember, only body gone, spirit still there, only cover gone." Then he heads into his room and at the threshold turns around to wave at us briskly, "Good night, thank you," and then is gone as we head back into the golden flares of late afternoon. Thank you, Don. I'm never going to find a reader as good as you. I see every nuance in that book.
Beautiful as always. So I'd love to open the floor up to questions. Does anybody have a question? Pico. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Steve.
First of all, thank you, Pico and Dawn, for being here tonight. It's wonderful. It's really nice to hear the parts of Japanese culture that charmed you as a foreigner. And I was wondering if, having lived there for, what has it been, 23 years now, if that has in turn caused you to be charmed by certain aspects of American culture.
What a wonderful question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, and the
Thank
question
you.
was whether my 32 years in Japan and being charmed by Japanese culture have opened my eyes to the charms of American culture. And the beauty of travel is getting to see our country, which we take for granted, or whose insufficiencies we're so sensitive to, through the eyes of a wondering or admiring or dreaming foreigner, or respectful foreigner, aware of all the things we have here that they don't have in their countries. I had a very spirited Ethiopian cab driver in San Francisco this morning, and I asked her, what's the best thing about America? And she said that I could leave my arranged marriage and live as a single mother and not have any of the stigma and pressure I would have in Ethiopia. And I was so grateful for that answer, because I was enchanted by Ethiopia too, and I hadn't known enough about it to realize how, as a woman born into that culture, she would suffer through so many pressures. A woman born into Japan, as I was saying, has such constrained opportunities. I was just talking to Don and Kuniko-san, his Japanese wife, beforehand, and she was telling me how if a Japanese woman, when she graduated from university, spoke fluent English and Spanish, she wasn't even allowed to get a job. So naturally, Kuniko-san, like my wife Hiroko, would be much more keen to be in this part of the world than that. Whenever Hiroko comes my wife comes to California, she's very keen, for example, to see the ghost towns of the John Wayne Western, which I would never think to see. But suddenly, through her excited, wide-awake eyes, I see that they're beautiful. And you know, if I'm rolling my eyes when she's looking at ghost towns, she's rolling my eyes as I'm dragging her around the 8th century temples of Kyoto, which are to her equivalent, you know, their backyard, the things that she's known all her life. So I think one of the beauties of this age is so many of us are marrying people from radically different cultures, which means this exchange of fresh eyes. And then when we go to their culture, my hope is always when I go to Kyoto, I will show Hiroko what a magical, rare city she grew up in, and she does the same for me whenever she comes here. And I think going back and forth between California and Japan for so long, I very much see California as the land of possibility and a place consecrated to the pursuit of happiness. And Japan still very much founded on the Buddhist idea of the reality of suffering. And I think for me, as a young kid, what I needed to learn about was possibility. I was coming from England, where there's no chance of any social mobility whatsoever. So all my friends wanted to come to this country because you can genuinely make a new life here and rewrite your destiny. That's probably why my Japanese wife married me, with the notion of rewriting a destiny in a non-Japanese script. So I'm so thrilled that this country still represents that for the rest of the world. And whatever the reality, the legend is very durable. So the American dream still captivates the world, even if there are aspects of the American reality that are less enchanting. And then, as I say, I hope to bring the charm that you rightly refer to my wife when she's looking around our neighborhood.
Other question for Pico?
Question. I have traveled to Japan several times on business representing a large corporation. And when I first went there, I was coached, because I was going to be presenting to a Japanese audience of mid-level executives and salarymen and who will be sleeping, and then the junior men will be taking the notes. And they can sleep sitting up and never fall over, which is a truly specific Japanese skill. But they said, don't worry, you'll have to change your cadence and speak slowly and allow the translators to work. But nobody would challenge you because, according to what I understood to be an old Japanese saying, the nail that stands up will be hammered down.
Sorry?
The nail that stands up will be hammered down,
yes.
which I assume you're familiar with.
Yes.
And to the Westerner, it sounded so harsh, you know,
Yes.
that you will not be an individual, and if you express individuality, you will quickly be put back in place.
Yes.
Now, that didn't turn out to be true. They stood up and challenged me at times. So there was some change in the culture. But when you talk about ping pong, you talk about baseball, that was the first thing I thought about.
Yeah.
And yet you talk, of course, the way you present it is much more harmonious.
Yes.
And it is about harmony.
Yes.
I guess my question is, could you kind of speak to both the one's Western feelings about this and one's Japanese feelings about this? I mean, on the one hand, it sounded so harsh to me.
Mm.
On the other hand, it is the basis of harmony.
Yes.
I don't know, if you could at least speak to that and how that worked for you.
Such a thoughtful question, and for those who didn't hear, this is a gentleman who did business often in Japan and was told the central maxim of Japan, which is certainly true, the nail that sticks out has to be hammered down. Incredible pressure towards conformity, which is one reason I would never want to be Japanese. And I think it's one reason that Japan is losing out big time geopolitically across the globe, because I think the treatment of women is really retrograde, far behind that even of China and South Korea. The treatment of foreigners is far behind that of the rest of the world. In terms of English proficiency, they're 29th out of 30 countries in Asia, far below North Korea, Cambodia, Nepal, Tajikistan. Every time they saw me come into the country, they strip searched me. I look exactly like the person they don't want to see coming into their country. And maybe that's the beginning of my answer to that question. And especially in the 1990s, they'd see me arrive and they assumed I was Saddam Hussein's cousin or an Iranian trying to migrate illegally because they had a serious problem with a loophole whereby Iranians were coming in without visas by the tens of thousands. Or they just assumed, worst of all, that I am what I am, a wandering Indian. And so they would take me to another room and give me a really, really, really hard time. As soon as I was in the country, people couldn't have been more gracious and polite at every turn, but I got very much the sense they'd be much happier without a disheveled, dark-faced, dark-skinned person in their midst. And yet, I couldn't complain too much about that because, just as you perfectly said, it was a reflection of their preservation of the harmony, which is part of what attracted me to Japan. And what I so appreciated was that the whole country works like a symphony orchestra. Everybody knows her part, she plays it perfectly, they create a beautiful sound greater than the sum of its parts. And they've done that for 1400 years. And when somebody like me comes into their country, I'm stumbling along, I can't read a note of music, I don't have the score of music, I don't have the score before me, I can only disrupt this thing they've worked so hard to construct. And that's one reason that I live on a tourist visa. To reassure my neighbors, don't worry, I don't want to be Japanese. And to keep myself honest, I could never be Japanese. If I live there 50 years, however much sympathy I feel in my heart, I'll always be a gaijin, which means outsider person. And that's fine. You also touch upon a really interesting point, which is the other reason I've lived on the tourist visa for 32 years is I've never wanted to engage with corporate official Japan, which to me includes the least interesting and imaginative sides, and it's really the domestic and interior private sphere that I find so rich in secrets and surprises. I was reading, there's a great book called Things Japanese, brought out more or less at the end of the 19th century by somebody called Basil Hall Chamberlain, an Englishman who taught at the University of Tokyo in the Meiji period. And even 130 years ago, he said, everyone doing business in the Far East prefers doing business in China, but prefers taking vacations in Japan. Japan is impossible to do business with, he said, because for all the reasons you know and many others that you didn't mention. But they're deciding to do things on their own terms, and they won't speak the language of the world metaphorically as well as literally. Whereas Western traders in those days felt that they could get a deal done in Beijing or Shanghai or Seoul perhaps. So I'm really glad I've never had to work in Japan, and I think certainly a lot of the beauty of the place would disappear if I were in that kind of framework.
Well, if I could add on a bit, once the workday was over and the formality was stripped away, and I would go to a bar with coworkers, the warmth and that kind of spontaneity that that you do experience was just, it was all there.
Yes.
And so I saw this other side.
Yes.
And it was wonderful. And then I began to understand, okay, you are this way at the office.
Exactly.
And you are far warmer and more available as a human when you're in your own spaces or you're in your social spaces.
I think everything's determined by context there.
Yeah.
And we are the same way. If all of us were to write an email about this evening, if we wrote it to our mother, we'd write it in one way. If we wrote it to our partner, we'd write it in another. If we wrote it to our daughter, still a third. We have these different voices, but we don't inhabit them as fully, I think, as my Japanese neighbors do. Somebody a couple of days ago was asking me about the very young girls you see in Japan who are dressed in skirts that stop here, more or less. They would make the Las Vegas residents blush. And I was saying they may be actually startlingly innocent, and the woman in cardigan and pearls who looks primness itself may be wild, according to my wife. But you can't tell anything from surfaces in Japan because they're just roles that people are choosing to occupy. And as you found, so when you were dining with your colleagues, they were, as it were, at the baseball stadium, and when it was work, they were your unbudgeable wall, probably.
Right. And the rules change.
Oh, yeah.
Depending on where you are.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, your use of language is spectacular, and I'm sure we all enjoy it tremendously, and I'm not the only one. I'm interested why you haven't studied Japanese seriously. You've been there a long time, and there's so much depth and nuance and different levels of language there.
Yes, such a good question. And I would see and understand much more if I did. I decided early on not to learn Japanese, and it's the only thing in life I've succeeded in. Partly because I go there to write a lot. I'm glad I can't watch TV. I can't eavesdrop on people. I can live that much more easily in a parallel universe of a project. But also, Lafcadio Hearn, one of the other great foreigners in Japan in the late 19th century, said, what's the point of speaking Japanese if you can't feel Japanese? In other words, so much of Japan is about the unspoken, and it's all about reading silences, reading the air, as they say, reading body language. Japan is a rare country where if a foreigner gets into a cab and speaks fluent Japanese, they often feel trespassed upon or intruded upon. They're not so happy. If you get into a cab and just say konnichiwa, they say, wow, you speak great Japanese. That's what you're meant to be. In the pageant of Japanese life, a foreigner is meant to speak very little Japanese, and then that computes in some ways. And again, many people are surprised. I've been with my wife 32 years, and she speaks very limited English. But genuinely, we've never had communications problems. And as somebody coming from England, I truly feel I have worse communications problems when I'm in California with the illusion of the common language. And there's a clarity that comes from the fact that we speak each other's languages imperfectly. And the other thing that I notice is that when, as I was saying before, when I show my wife around California or England, places I know quite well, she sees things I would never see precisely because she doesn't speak the language. She's not distracted by stuff. And I'm always on edge waiting, how does Hiroko think about, we were in Boston for the first time last week, where I used to live. I wanted to know what she thought about Boston. And I realized that her command of English would bear very little relation to the strength and power of her response to the place. And so when I see her reading America through very limited English, I think, well, there's certain things I could probably read about Japan, even though my Japanese is not so good. Proust wonderfully said, I don't claim to know English, but I do know Ruskin. And this book about Japan, I don't claim to know much Japanese, but I've known my Japanese wife and son and daughter for 32 years, and so in some ways they've been a gateway to some understanding. But it's such a good question. And the last thing I will say was every now and then, Don actually speaks beautiful Japanese, but most important, he speaks it with gentleness and modesty and self-effacement. Occasionally I'll meet foreign friends who'll come and they'll say to me instantly, I speak great Japanese. And they'll talk for about 4 hours about how great their Japanese is. And I'll think, well, the first thing about speaking Japanese is you never say anything in the form of self-advertisement. You're always self-deprecating, in fact, and you would actually never be talking about yourself or achievements. So maybe you speak the language, but I wonder if you really speak Japanese. And I wonder if you're putting your Japanese friends at ease by telling them for 4 hours you speak great Japanese.
Hi, thank you so much, both of you. It's just wonderful to hear you speak. Just curious about some of the things you said about women's roles and wondering how, like your daughter or younger people, younger women there, are things changing? Are they keeping the harmony? Because clearly...
Yes.
Right, the question is how are things changing for women, younger women especially in Japan?
And I think there are quite a few people in Japan, in this room rather, starting with Don and his wife, who know much more about Japan than I do and are better qualified to answer. But my first year in Japan, the book I wrote was about the predicament of women and their need to escape Japan. And my sense is 31 years later, things haven't improved so much. Prime Minister Abe is always proudly saying that 67% of women in Japan have jobs, which is a higher percentage here. What he doesn't say is many of them are sub-poverty level wages. Single mothers are reduced to prostitution to support their families, and a woman who is as qualified as a man will never get the same salary in Japan. And when you ask about my son and my daughter, the whole archetype is there. So my daughter studied Spanish at university, and the day she graduated she moved to Spain, essentially, because she knew she could have a much richer life there with her Spanish boyfriend. My son, the day he graduated, joined Japan Airlines and lives a very conventional life in the suburbs because the system really favors men. And this actually goes back to what I was saying about being strip searched of all things. Because one day I was flying back to Tokyo in the 1990s from Hong Kong, and there was another person of Indian origin on the plane. So I said to him guilelessly, oh, this has happened to you. And he looked at me as if I was a kindergarten. He said, of course not. Because when I arrive in the customs area, and there are 15 lanes, and in 14 of them there are men, I go to the lane manned, so to speak, by a woman. And the woman will always say, welcome to Japan, we're so happy to see you. She has everything to gain from a foreigner entering. A man feels very unsettled, threatened by a man, foreign male, I think. So since then, I always did take a lane, and it should be said, no woman has ever wanted to strip search me, for many reasons, I'm sure. I wonder if
Yes,
should
I
we
think maybe.
begin to...
Sadly, I can't believe it, but we survived the warriors. It
Yeah.
sounds like they're doing okay, I don't know. But this was a magical evening. Thank you both so much, and thanks to all of you for being part of this, I don't know, celebration of great minds and wanderlust. It's beautiful.